The wig has come off. And if you weren't here last week, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, we are beginning our journey into Daring Greatly. How do you like our banner? Cool. I would like to thank Jerry Hurt, who has put hours and hours into creating our graphics. And not only that, but he was our first candidate for Daring Greatly. Because little did we know when we were helping him with the banner and he was, up that 32-foot ladder, that Jerry's afraid of heights. So Fred and I stood at the bottom going, "You're daring greatly, Jerry, you're daring greatly." So you get the first Daring Greatly award for the 5 weeks. Way to go, Jerry. Well, in the beginning of the book, Daring Greatly, Brene shares a part of a speech from Theodore Roosevelt from 1910 in Paris, France, often referred to as the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again. Because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. We are beginning a journey that is going to call us higher, that is going to invite us to walk through some fear, that is going to ask us to open up, that is going to bring us into a level of authenticity that perhaps we have not known before. And so you may wonder why we're talking about this in church on Sunday morning. Why this book? It's not really about God, is it? But I think you'll see, if not by the end of today, by the end of 5 weeks, exactly why we chose this book at this transformational time in our community. Because Daring Greatly is about being authentic and vulnerable, which is the key to connection. Connection with ourselves, connection with one another, and connection with God. Brené Brown says, vulnerability is not weakness. That myth is profoundly dangerous. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. It is also the key to connection, relationship, and worthiness. Vulnerability is not weakness, despite what we may have been taught. It is our greatest strength. But you see, we live in a culture of not enough. If you turn on the TV for 5 minutes, you'll get that message that you're not skinny enough, or pretty enough, or young enough. You're not taking the right vacations. You're not wearing the right clothes. Whatever it may be, those messages are all around us. And when we live in a culture of not enough, it is hard for us to believe that vulnerability is courage, because we've been taught to show up as perfect, to act like we have it all together, to put our best face forward. Never let them see you sweat. And yet, we can never really experience love and acceptance when we're not being ourselves. You know, we have a value here in our community of inclusivity, but sometimes even in unity, we feel like we have to be up and happy and positive. What about those days we're feeling depressed or down or grieving? Inclusivity is about accepting it all within ourselves and for each other. We have to begin to reframe this idea that vulnerability is weakness. Brene told a story about going in to speak in front of a group, and when she got there, the sign language interpreters were there, and they came up to her and they said, "Is there anything you're going to be talking a lot about? Any words or phrases you're going to use that we can be prepared for?" And she said, "Well, this is all about vulnerability, so that's a word I'm going to be using a lot." And so they put their heads together for a minute, and they seemed kind of confused, and they said, "Well, most of the time the sign for vulnerability is this, which means weak in the knees." She said, "No, no, 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 no. That's not what vulnerability is." And they said, "Well, there is one other sign that we use sometimes." And she said, "Well, what is that?" And they said this: opening the heart, opening the self. That is what vulnerability is about. And that takes courage. There's a book called Real Love by Greg Bear. In fact, there's a Real Love group that meets here that supports the ideas in that book. And Greg Bear says that real love is about showing our imperfections, showing our messiness, that we can never truly experience love unless we're willing to be seen. Because otherwise, the person that loves us is loving the self that we've put forward, that we've served up on the golden platter. The self that knows what it's doing, that has it going on, that has it all together. And we can't trust that love because it's false, because it's an illusion, because it's not who we really are. You see, the thing is, by the mere fact that we are human, we are vulnerable. If we're pretending not to be, it's an illusion. Because we could walk out this door this morning and get our hearts broken, or our bodies broken. And there's not a one of you in here who hasn't at some point in time had a little something hanging from your nose and you didn't know it. And as Alan so gracefully pointed out in between services, that for the men, it could be this. And that smell in the elevator is not always someone else. We're human. We are mighty spiritual beings, but we're having a human experience, and there's a reason for that experience. There's a reason we're in this vulnerable state. Because it is in that state we get to let go of ego, we get to let go of this idea that we're supposed to be perfect, and we get to connect at an authentic level and experience love in an unconditional way. Bear tells the story of this young man who was born into a royal family as a prince. But he was born with warts all over his face. And so as he grew up, the other kids made fun of him and teased him. And so he spent a lot of time alone, locked up in his room, until one day his father died, and he was forced to come out and be king, serve the people. And so he decided to put a bag over his head. Sure, he couldn't see that well, but at least it kept people from seeing him and making fun of him. Well, that worked for a while, but one day he realized that he was pretty lonely. That even though he might be able to threaten people not to make fun of him, that he wasn't really connecting with them. And so he went to see the wise man up on top of the mountain. He made his trek up there, and he sat down at his feet, and he took the bag off of his head. And the wise man said, "You have a lot of warts on your face." Well, that is not what the king wanted to hear. And so he got mad. He said, "I do not." And the wise man said, "Yes, yes, you do." And the king became so enraged that he ran down the hill, tripped and fell, and ended up in the lake and started to drown. Well, the wise men came and pulled him out, laid him down on the shore, and smiling at him, saw that he was okay. And the king said, "Why are you laughing at me?" He said, "I'm not laughing. I'm smiling at you because you're alive. You're okay." And the king caught his reflection in the water and he said, "Wow, I really do have a lot of warts on my face, don't I?" The wise man said, yes, you do." And he said, "Doesn't that repulse you?" And the wise man said, "Well, it doesn't repulse me any more than I'm repulsed by my own." For the first time, the king saw that the wise man too had warts on his face. But it didn't seem to bother him. And in the presence of the wise men, it didn't seem to bother the king. And so he left the bag there for good. And sure, there were still some people who made fun of him. But there's a whole lot more that were willing to connect with him. The key is this. Bear says, as you tell the truth about yourself, you create opportunities for others to accept and love you unconditionally. You see, we are hardwired for connection. We are hardwired for connection. And in the absence of love and belonging, we suffer. And if we suffer long enough, we end up hurting ourselves. We end up hurting the people that we love. As we accept ourselves, as we allow ourselves to be seen, we offer that connection. Because when I am real, I give you permission to be real. And we all get to let that down. Let down our guards. Let down that exhausting effort of keeping up the facade. And we connect. And love and belonging and connection is the key to peace. It's the key to healing of our planet. It's the key to healing ourselves. And the key to connection is vulnerability. And that's exactly why we're talking about that this morning. Brené Brown says, what makes you vulnerable makes you beautiful. The willingness to let another see you, not your polished self, but your messy self. For many, that's our greatest fear. To truly be seen. But it is also the avenue for love. You see, we build up these armors when we've been hurt, when we've been judged, when we've been criticized. We self-protect. But self-protection is an illusion because we may be keeping ourselves from getting our heart broken out here, but what are we doing to ourselves? We're breaking our own heart by not allowing anyone in. By not allowing that love and that belonging. There was a group of college students that were sitting around one night, as college students will, coming up with brilliant ideas, things they could do for fun. And this happened to be a group of guys, and they were sitting around talking about this idea of rejection and how hard it was for them to approach girls and to ask them out, and how rejection was just so humiliating. So they decided to make a game out of it. They decided to turn this idea of rejection on its head. And so they put a jar in the middle of the table, and they each put $20 in. And their goal was that at the end of the month, whoever was rejected the most times would win that money. And so the guys set about approaching women in bars and at parties. And they shared all the worst things about themselves that they could think of with these girls, just trying to be rejected. But a funny thing happened. They ended up actually getting more dates than they had before. Because what they realized was that they were showing their real self. And guess what? Authenticity is sexy. When they let down that facade and when they stopped trying to be something they weren't and come across as some Casanova, the women liked them more. Food for thought. And the other reason we're talking about this morning is that if we don't believe ourselves worthy of love, loving ourselves, the love of other people, then we can never believe ourselves worthy of the love of God. Because that protection, that armor, isn't just between you and others. It's between you and God. Because God is the unconditional love that is possible. But only if we let it in, only if we open up, only if we allow ourselves to be seen and know that our mistakes and our failings make us even more lovable. When we can embrace that, then we can know unconditional acceptance. Showing up as our true selves may be scary, and it may be tough. If you've been hurt in the past, the idea of opening yourself up to others, to being yourself, that can be scary. But it's not as scary as the thought of waking up at the end of your life and wondering what it could have been like if you had been fully engaged in it, if you had been fully open to the love that was possible, if you'd allowed yourself to be seen, to express as the truth of who you are. We're not here to hold back. I would like to share a story with you about a moment that I witnessed as, in my life, has been the greatest demonstration of vulnerability. And it's a story about my dad. You see, my dad, in his later years, developed Alzheimer's disease. And anyone who's dealt with a loved one that has that, you know how difficult that can be to watch someone walk through that. My dad was not a warm and fuzzy kind of guy. He had a lot of layers of protection. He was well armored. He had the capacity for great love and had a big heart that would come through in select moments. But for the most part, he stayed guarded. He could be critical and even mean. Well, as I watched my dad struggle with losing his memory, with not being able to come up with a thought, with realizing that this was happening to him, I saw this vulnerability that I had never seen in him before. This man that I had always known to be strong suddenly was vulnerable. And as this progressed along the way, my mom passed away. And there were moments after that that he couldn't remember if she was alive or not, and I would have to remind him, and he would cry and he would grieve. But what I saw happen over the following months was that suddenly that armor that was there was beginning to fall away. And whatever was going on in his mind and his heart, his defenses started to fall. And in those last few months, when I would come walking down the hall, his face would light up. And he'd have tears in his eyes, and he'd open his arms and say, "I love you." And when I brought him cupcakes and a present for his birthday, he would cry, say, I don't deserve this. And I said, "Yes, you do, Dad. Yes, you do." He became loving and affectionate and sweet to the staff around him. Without those defenses, that heart that was in there all along was able to be seen. And in those moments, my dad and I shared a love more profound than we had at any point in my life. And in those moments, I was healed, and so was he. And we both have been able to take that away, me into this lifetime and he into the next. And yes, it hurt. And yes, it was heartbreaking. But it was profound love that neither one of us had been able to know before that moment with one another. It takes courage. It takes courage. So what does that look like? Well, it's about when you're scared, saying, "I'm scared." When you've made a mistake, admitting you made a mistake. When you're hurt, saying you're hurt. When you don't know, saying, I don't know. When you're in love, saying you're in love. It's letting that truth come out to be seen. Our co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, in the book, How to Let God Help You, said it this way. As we realize that we are God's children, that we have power and authority to think and speak the good and true and have it manifest in our lives, we no longer invite or submit to inharmony, misunderstanding, or limitations. We place ourselves in God's keeping and think what is true, and it directs us in ways of peace. As we think of others as God's children, we see them in a new light. We understand how it is that they are trying to unfold and use the faculties and powers God has implanted in them. And we have compassion if they seem to fall short at times. We have the power to speak truth for them, to bless them, and to help them. As we accept our imperfections, as we allow ourselves to show up even when things are messy, we give others permission to do the same. We call that out in them. That is the journey of being human. That is why we are here, to know the kind of vulnerability that allows us to connect and be loved. And so today in your bulletin, you were given a bookmark that looks like this, and if you would pull it out. It has a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that says, "To be beautiful means to be yourself. You don't need to be accepted by others, you need to accept yourself." So, as we had discussion around this affirmation, we questioned whether this 3 words, ironically, was enough. Did we need to say more? But what I know is that at the root of every spiritual challenge we have, there's a sense of unworthiness. And it really is about knowing this. So, would you affirm this slowly and intentionally with me? I am enough. I am enough. I am enough.